uh, just let me know. Yvonne, I hope that you'll let me know if it's not working. Yeah.
Yeah, it is working well.
Great. Okay. So let me just start by contextualizing this talk a little bit. The talk is part of a larger project of mine um, in which I've tried to advance here in the United States, but also in some parts of the European context and in England, a post-colonial sociology. My main statement on post-colonial sociology is in this book from 2016, where I talk about what I mean by post-colonial theory and think about what post-colonial theory means for social science. My talk today can be seen as a kind of extension of that larger project. It's on anti-colonial thought, which in this book here I suggest is kind of the first wave of post-colonial thought. So my talk today is a kind of continuation of this larger project. But I want to start in the year 1899 with a quote. Society is an association of men who are together for mutual help so that each could enjoy the highest possible well-being, a situation that can never be arrived at by the sole efforts of individuals without the aid of others. A man cannot live alone. He cannot alone build his house, weave his clothes, and produce the food and other items he needs. You can all see that quote, yeah? Great. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me is that the writer of this quote is obviously trying to define and theorize what society is at a time when many others were doing the same thing. This was written in 1899, as I said, which is 6 years after the Department of Sociology was established at the University of Chicago, which was the first department of sociology in the United States. This was also soon around the same time that the first doctorate in sociology in the US was awarded at Cornell University. It was also not long after the American Journal of Sociology was created, and the year after Emile Durkheim founded the journal L'Année Sociologique in France, and 1 year after the London School of Economics was founded. It was also 1 year after these other texts in the US were published. Franklin Giddens' founding sociological text, Gabriel Tarde in France published his seminal work, Social Laws, an Outline of Sociology. So the passage I started with was written at an important time for American and European and English sociology. But what's interesting is that this quote that I gave you was not from any of these sociologists. It comes instead from this man. His name is Apollinario Mabini. He was part of the revolutionary government established in the Philippines, the government that had declared the Philippines an independent republic and that was rebelling against Spanish United States rule. Mabini, in fact, became known as the brains of that revolution. He helped create the new government and write the new constitution. Mabini, in short, was an anti-colonial activist, political official, and thinker striving to create a new nation under the threat of extinction by foreign imperial powers, including, at that time, the United States, the very country where disciplinary sociology was emerging at that time as the dominant institutional form of social thought. So, what interests me here is not whether Mabini's conceptualization of society offers some radically new divergent statement or theory, but what interests me first is that he had a concept of society. Mabini was thinking about and writing about society amidst his anti colonial revolution. Just as Durkheim was thinking about society in France, just as the Chicago school sociologists were creating their own sociological program, while their fellow countrymen were invading the Philippines and killing Mabini's comrades in the jungles and mountains of the Philippines, Mabini was thinking about and theorizing society. And in fact, Mabini's theory of society was a crucial part of his political activism. Mabini was not thinking about and writing about society because he wanted to have an article accepted in the European Journal of Sociology. He was writing and thinking about society because he wanted to theorize why a society should revolt against colonial rulers. He wanted to know something about society so that he could better create a post-colonial government for that society. So this is the theme of my talk today, not Mabini in particular, but more broadly, anti-colonial thought and social theory, more precisely, anti-colonial thought as social theory. And what I want to show in my time here, in the next 40 minutes or so, is that Mabini was part of a larger tradition of social thought, an anti-colonial tradition spanning the colonized world and beyond in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I want to show how this was a critical and rich body of writing and thinking about society that we should consider recovering and reappreciating. Even as dominant metropolitan sociology, such as here in the United States, has excluded this body of thinking on the grounds that it's not really sociology, on the grounds that it's not really social theory or social thought. And this argument today that I'm making is partly in a recent edited collection I have with Anahid Al-Hardan, a fellow sociologist at Howard University, formerly in Beirut. And this book, as well as my previous work, is all part of this knowledge project that many of us are engaged in. I know some of you are also engaged in it as well. This is a larger project at seeking some kind of epistemic remedy, right? It's part of a larger discussion about the provinciality of dominant European sociology, the Eurocentrism of social theory, conversations about how to rethink the canon, how to expand the canon, how to globalize social science and retool our analytic and theoretical toolkit so as to better account for the dilemmas of the world. And what many scholars have been doing is, again, as some of you may already know, is they've been trying to expand our theoretical repertoire through various types of projects. Folks have spoken of bringing in decolonial theory, of indigenizing social theory, of provincializing social theory, of creating a non-Eurocentric social theory, of a Southern theory, as Raywin Connell talks about it, and so on and so on. So my talk on anti-colonial thought today can be situated as part of this larger conversation. And as I said, it's part of my larger project on post-colonial sociology. But as I hope you'll see by the end of my talk, while this intervention today can be seen as part of these existing attempts, as part of this conversation, it also differs from the proposals that have been offered in crucial ways. I'll clarify that at the end. But to understand my intervention, I think we have to begin with some history. I am, after all, not only interested in social theory, I'm also a historical sociologist of empire. And so I think history is important here. And let me start with a brief history of my own discipline, sociology. Now, when we learn about the history of sociology in the United States and in Britain and other parts of Europe, what we learn is that sociology was founded in these core countries as a response to industrialization. The Chicago School of Sociology focused on problems of urbanization and immigration. Durkheim sociology was meant to address the new modern division of labor that he saw in France, problems of social integration and anomie, and so on. But for understanding my intervention today, we need to recognize a different history, a history that situates sociology less within the context of industrialization in the core countries, and more within the history of imperialism. After all, social scientists today operate, those social scientists today, my colleagues in the United States or Britain, Germany, and France, we working in these contexts, for the most part, work within a framework of imperial thought. Not imperial because social science is inherently racist or something like that, but because of its history and legacies. Disciplinary sociology, social science more broadly, I've argued, and others have argued, was born in, of, and for the Western empires. Let's not forget that the very notion of the social as a space between nature and the spiritual realm that emerged in European thought was born in the 18th and 19th centuries and resonated among European male elites to try to make sense of and to try to manage social upheaval, social disorder, resistance from workers, women, and colonized natives. In the United States, it's interesting. One of the first books with the word sociology in the title was published in 1854 by a man named George Fitzhugh. It was called Sociology for the South, or The Failure of Free Society, and it deployed the social concept to vindicate the slave system in the American South. Then in the early 19th and 20th centuries, the social science discipline, social science became more institutionalized. Social thought became further tethered to empire. This was, of course, a time, as this map conveys, when empires themselves were expanding or consolidating. You can see the colonial possessions of world powers by 1914. Colonization was more or less complete, taking over the entire world. And this was at the same time that sociology in the US was emerging, sociology and social theory was being institutionalized in various places. If you look at this chart of data I've collected, I've used in various work on the number of new colonies taken by the Anglo-European empires, you'll see that the late 19th century, this period was, exactly the time when you had, on the one hand, the new imperialism, more and more colonies being taken, but at the same time, this process of institutionalizing sociology. So just as sociology in the US was emerging, we were undergoing this new imperialism. And as Raywin Connell points out, early sociology in this period reflected the interests of this new imperial formation, manifesting the worldview of white male elites in the rising metropolitan centers of empire. This means that the questions that were asked by sociology in the early 20th century reflected the concerns and categories of these elites and of imperial power broadly. From its anxieties about social disorder to its attachment to social Darwinism, its focus upon the so-called Negro problem in the United States, questions of how to properly assimilate immigrants, its promulgation of race theory, Weber and Durkheim's Orientalist and Essentialist lenses for discussing other cultures. In all of these respects and more, sociology reflected the questions of interest to imperial centers, embedded the worldview of those metropoles, thus expressing what I've called elsewhere the imperial standpoint. This is a way of thinking about how empire has impacted social theory and social sciences by thinking about its standpoint in a global context. Now, of course, today, sociology is very different. It's also expanded all around the world, so there's a lot of different incarnations. But I would argue that many aspects of sociology, even in many other countries outside Europe and the United States, still carry the imprint of this imperial history. This is seen in social theory's persistent essentialism, its analytic bifurcations, its metrocentrism, and many other operations, which I've discussed in elsewhere, many in this book, that 2016 book, Post-Colonial Thought and Social Theory, that I've discussed. I can't really go into all of this here, but suffice to say that the structure of the imperial episteme persists in diverse parts of metropolitan sociological thinking and elsewhere, and that this structure must be recognized as a legacy of sociology's imperial history. This then raises the issue of an alternative history that we might tell. And that history is also tied to empire, but it is not a history of empire's standpoint, but of resistance to empire. And here then we come to my theme, anti-colonialism. After all, the spread of the British, European, and American empires in the 19th and 20th centuries did not go uncontested. Colonized peoples everywhere responded with various forms of resistance, not least was through organizing anti-colonial nationalist movements. I began, of course, with Mabini and the Philippine Revolt against Spanish and US rule in 1899. But those of you who know the history will know that this was a larger trend that began in the early 20th century. Many say that it culminates in the 1955 Bandung Conference. But there have been various other conferences before this, various nationalist movements around the world, with World War II, of course, marking a pivotal moment. So there's a whole history here of anti-colonialism. And what I'm interested in is not just the fact of anti-colonial resistance, but the complex ideational, epistemic components of it. For with the proliferation of anti-colonialism also came a proliferation of new discourses from colonized peoples. This was an anti-colonial discourse critiquing empires, critiquing colonialism, and their correlates like capitalism, racialized capitalism, and racism. And these were all discourses, ideas, a whole set of texts produced, speeches given, poems written, political pamphlets written. And this was all part of a political movement of anti-colonialism, but it was also containing, I'm arguing, a whole series of ideas on society. So while sociology and social theory was institutionalized in the metropolitan imperial cores, reflecting the imperial episteme, anti-colonial thought was forming from the ground up and the dark underside of empire. And this body of thought offered new ways of thinking about, of theorizing and understanding society that amounts to a kind of critical alternative sociology. But who were these anti-colonial thinkers I'm talking about? Well, by my criteria of anti-colonial, what we have are far too many, right? Too many thinkers to name. Many of their texts we won't ever be able to access. But let me just clarify some points here to give you a bigger picture of what I mean. First, most of these anti-colonial thinkers were born in or lived in the colonies and drew upon their experiences there. These included everyone from, say, Apolinario Mabini, who I mentioned, or Jose Rizal in the Philippines. I would also say their contemporary Eugenio Maria de Hostos in Puerto Rico, which was part of the US empire. And then, of course, you have all of these figures, Fanon, Césaire, and Nkrumah, a whole bunch of figures. I put these here because many of these are the ones I'll refer to. But again, there's many more that we could talk about. You also have anti-colonial thinkers circulating in London, in Paris, in Berlin at the time, where they met with each other, they shared ideas. Many were part of the Comintern, the Communist International, and so on. Many were also in metropolitan centers themselves, like Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who was an indigenous activist born on the Oneida Reservation in the United States and Wisconsin. And she and other indigenous thinkers represent an anti-colonial thinking that operated within the confines of settler colonialism, living and fighting from within the internalized colonized spaces of empire. The other point I want to stress is that anti-colonial thought came from a variety of social positions along a continuum, right? So on the one hand, you had some anti-colonial thinkers who were in fact actual academics teaching in lower schools or universities. This would include people like Du Bois, but it also include Radha Makal Mukherjee in India, or Abdel Malek Sayad in Algeria, or Hmati Amel in writing in the professional Middle East context. But there was many others. There were activists, there were political leaders, journalists who weren't officially sociologists or academics, but who nonetheless wrote and produced ideas on society. So Maybelle Dove Dankwa is one example. She was a journalist and political activist. And Pedro Albizu Campos was the leader of the nationalist movement in Puerto Rico. We might also include international lawyers or various types of professions, doctors. The point is that these were all engaged in anti-colonial movements, and as such, they were part of a larger discourse, producing new ideas about society as they critiqued empire. And so this is important to me to include people who weren't necessarily sociologists, because I would argue that anti-colonial social thought did not typically come in the form of academic writing, right? It came in journalistic writings, political pamphlets, speeches, art, poetry, other forms and mediums. And this is part of the challenge, right? While institutional social sciences would dismiss this body of work as not social science, as not theory, because it wasn't academic. I'm asking us to surpass this limitation, read these writings and hear their words and these ideas with a more open mind. And this gets to my larger claim. Despite the fact that these thinkers were not card-carrying social scientists, they nevertheless offered up important ideas and knowledge about the social world. They often, I would argue, offered innovative ideas about society, about social relations that we might learn from. So let me just now turn to some of these ideas and concepts that anti-colonial thought offers. So I want to spend the rest of my time talking about some of these ideas, just to give you a sense of what I mean when I say that anti-colonial discourse does contain social thought, social theory, however, in a form that would be considered more crude than our fellow academics would want us to have us think. And let me discuss some overarching themes that I think come up when you read a lot of different anti-colonial thinkers. One of the themes is, of course, the social itself, the theorizing society itself. And I want to discuss a few different approaches that I found as I've read some of these thinkers. First, let me return to Apollinario Mabini, with whom I began this talk. As I said earlier, he defines society in this way. And when you dig into his other writings, when you dig into the larger work here, what you see is that Mabini is actually theorizing society as a series of reciprocal exchanges and obligations. Now, this idea of society as a series of reciprocal exchanges and obligations summons, of course, the exchange theories of the Scottish Enlightenment, not least of Adam Smith, some versions of European social contract theory, maybe Mauss on gift exchange. And I think Mabini might have been familiar with some of these theories from his studies of law in Manila. But again, this is in 1899, before someone like Mauss, for example. But there's a couple of more specific things here I want to mention. First, while we might say that this theorization, this conceptualization of society appropriates some ideas of social contract theory, Mabini actually does something a little different. He merges them with Spanish Catholicism ideas and ultimately ends up with a different theory. While the Scottish Enlightenment were famously individualistic and emphasized market exchange, for instance, Mabini theorizes mutual obligation as part of society, as a crucial part of society. And he theorizes this as natural law, existing prior to and above individuals. More precisely, he claims that the reciprocal obligations of society's members express the natural law of reason, or in Mabini's Spanish, razón, which also translates into the word right. Ultimately, then, in Mabini's approach, society is not reducible to the market where self-interested individuals exchange material goods, nor does it emerge from a Hobbesian state of anarchy, but rather begins always already as a series of reciprocal exchanges and obligations seen as rights maintained by reason. To fulfill social obligations was exactly, for Mabini, to fulfill natural law. And these fulfillments, these reciprocal obligations and exchanges constituted society. The other thing to note is that this creative rearticulation of European notions of exchange and the social contract was developed amidst and through anti-colonial struggle. Ultimately, Mabini writes about these ideas of society to vindicate the Philippine Revolution. Mabini argues that foreign colonizers like Spain and then the US transgress natural law by their colonization because they were not reciprocal in their actions. They appropriate from Philippine society, they colonize Philippine society without giving anything back. And because of this, they could and should be legitimately overthrown and replaced with a new government, one which would restore the proper workings of society by better ensuring the smooth flow of reciprocal exchange and obligation. So you see, if disciplinary sociology at the time in the United States was emerging to justify imperialism, Mabini's social theory emerged to justify anti-imperialism. So that's one approach that I found. Society is a series of reciprocal exchanges and obligations. Another one is where you see anti-colonial thinkers talking about society as interdependent with the spiritual and natural world. And one thing to consider here is the fact that colonialism, even though I'm speaking about it as a singular thing, was variable, right? There was a lot of different forms in which colonialism could take. For example, Mabini theorized society in the context of Spanish colonial mercantilism, whereby the Philippines' agrarian society was tethered to an extractive, almost tributary form of colonial domination. But other colonized peoples faced different colonial logics, different problematics of domination, as I would call them. Indigenous peoples subjected to settler colonialism, for instance, did not face mercantilist extraction, but rather dispossession and displacement from the land. And this, I think, shaped a different way of thinking about the social. And this is where we come to society as interdependent with the spiritual and natural world. One example is the writings of Laura Cornelius Kellogg, who I mentioned earlier. She was a founding member of the Society of American Indians in the early 20th century, and she was motivated by struggles to restore land and autonomy for indigenous Americans. And amidst these struggles, she articulated a view of social relations as inextricably tethered to nature and spirits. According to Kellogg, Indian society before the intrusion of colonialism was very different from the Hobbesian state of nature that Hobbes and Locke and others portrayed Indian society to be. It was rather one where the red man was brother of the gods, living with beautiful watercourses in the great forests. So you see here, right? If you this full quote, this notion of indigenous peoples as living happily within nature, but also where society is embedded in nature, connected, fully connected to nature. She also explains how the tribes or nations of these societies aggregated into the larger unit, the five nations of the Confederacy. And they were not woven together by joint economic or political interests, but by the summoning of the eagle. Each nation is free unto itself like a free man, but when the eagle gives the cry, they are one heart, one head, one man, they join together. In Kellogg's conception, therefore, the unity of society and of multiple societies is obtained through the command of the spirit's material manifestation and the natural realm. In other words, what we're seeing here is that Kellogg did not separate humans, the spirits, and land. And this conception, of course, had political value. It opened up a trenchant critique of settler colonialism, but it also has conceptual value. Kellogg was writing at a time when dominant conceptions of society were coming from the Chicago School, which theorized society as a series of relations among men based upon resemblances. Human relations with the land or with the gods were bracketed out, right? Society was abstracted from natural relations, abstracted from the environment. But Kellogg and other indigenous thinkers, amidst their anti-colonial struggles against dispossession, offered a notion of society as an intricate web of interdependence between spirits, humans, and nature, of which land was a crucial part, a sort of thick interdependence of elements that environmentalist sociologists today, right, urge us to recognize. Long before Bruno Latour tried to get us to re-theorize the social as an assemblage consisting of humans and nature and material objects, Kellogg and indigenous anti-colonialists were articulating an early version of that theory. A similar idea comes from Radha Kamal Mukherjee. This is a thinker who, there's a chapter in this book that I mentioned with Anhid Al-Hadan on him by Joshua Silver. Mukherjee wrote in the 1920s when he landed upon what we can think of as an ecological theory of the social. And in one of his founding declarations, he declares, man and the region, by region he meant the local natural environment, are not separate but mutually interdependent entities, plastic, fluent, growing. And he opposes this conception directly to the so-called human ecological approach, which some American sociologists have been arguing and anthropologists have been constructing, which he says, quote, has almost been entirely concerned with biotic factors, with the effects of man upon man, discarding often enough the trees and animals, land and water, and undue prominence has been given in history and economics to these purely human influences. He goes on to argue that what is needed is a sociology that stresses not only the intimate ecologic interrelations of man, but also his close alliance with the entire range of ecologic forces, his cooperation in the conservation of the land and the use of water, in the management of forests and rivers, or in the domestication of the use of livestock and the control of insects and bacteria and parasites. And this way of thinking about social relations by Mukherjee opened up all kinds of innovation. And what is notable is how it fueled his passionate critique of colonialism in India. Prefiguring Latin American dependency theories, Mukherjee criticizes colonialism for thrusting weaker societies into a larger exploitative division of labor, whereby colonized societies are forced into a system of export monoculture. The system, he says, entails new forms of bonded labor, which he says were more inhuman than the old system of domestic slavery. He also notes that the system of exploitation had devastating ecological effects. You can read that here, just one example. He describes this as a slow injection of poison into the system of colonized society by conscienceless members of civilized people. So again, this is a novel conception of the social, one which did not separate humans from nature as our theories in mainstream sociology tend to do, and it went hand in hand with anti-colonial critique. The third and final idea of society that I want to talk about briefly is society as racially compartmentalized, as essentially fractured along racial lines. Frantz Fanon, for instance, portrayed Algerian society under French rule as fundamentally broken along racial lines, forming a compartmentalized society of the racialized privileged and the racially abject. Writing at a time when neo-Durkheimian Parsonian theories of society emphasized social cohesion and social integration, Fanon says that society is divided into distinct worlds, those of the colonizer and the colonized, the settler and the native. And these are two distinct spaces, a Manichaean world divided up into these different departments, right? These racialized departments. This is a famous quote, so I don't think I need to read it. Many of you might be familiar with it. But again, what's really interesting to me here is that this is a nascent theory of society. It's a way of conceptualizing society that is very different from the dominant social theories, which thought of it as cohesive, as integrative, right? Fanon is pointing out that actually society is fundamentally structured along racial lines, not just class lines either, right? This isn't just a Marxist one. At most, it's race and class, colonized or colonized, new cleavages in society that he's pointing out, and that existing dominant social theory was much less prone to theorize and think about. And if you read his other work, you see how he explores how this compartmentalization of society reflects the economic contradictions generated by colonial rule, how it structures social space, how it structures urban relations, and has powerful cultural and psychological effects for colonizer and colonized alike. Again, I think a whole theory, right, coming from Fanon, partly rooted in this new innovative theory of society as fundamentally structured and divided. And again, very different from existing dominant theories at the time. Other thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, the Bissauan, Guinean, and Cape Verdean revolutionary, similar ideas about what he called the social situation in Portuguese colonies, right? Complete racial segregation, he says, that furthers the interest of colonialism. And he adds how institutions like cafes or bars, which according to metropolitan socialists at the time were sites of social integration and leisure, are actually the privilege only of Europeans, right? He talks about how Africans weren't allowed to enter those spaces. And so, I can imagine Cabral reading Parsons or Durkheim's view of social institutions as spaces that function for social cohesion and asking, well, yes, but functional for whom, right? That these theories are really only meant to refer to the dominant white European class. Anti-colonial thinkers also built upon these basic pictures to paint more nuanced elements to social structure. Cabral wrote about how ethnic divisions intersected with colonial divisions. Fanon in Algeria wrote about the comprador bourgeoisie. So did Nguyen and Ninh in Vietnam. And they talked about all these complexifications of basic class structure in these societies. Another person of interest here is Mabel Dove Dankwa, who began her career as a journalist in Ghana during British rule and was an early advocate of anti-colonial feminism. And while she initially supported Kwame Nkrumah and was part of an independence movement, eventually she soured on his post-independence authoritarianism, masquerading as anti-colonial socialism, criticizing him and his gang as comprador bourgeoisie, masquerading as nationalists, much to the detriment of the nation. So she too was criticizing this post-colonial comprador bourgeoisie, thereby, complexifying these notions of class that we might find from conventional Marxist theories. You have also people like Du Bois making similar arguments. And what's interesting about Du Bois is that Du Bois also thought about society as racially bifurcated, as compartmentalized, sort of joining these other theories of society by Fanon and Cabral and so on, and prefiguring many of them. But what's important is that he says this reaches a global level, right? This is not just about colonized societies. This is about all societies all around the world. The color line belts the world, including in the United States, including in Europe, and all around the world, partly, he would suggest, because of imperialism itself, which sort of creates this larger racially bifurcated society. So what we have here are a variety of sociologies and conceptions of the social. And I think that there's other ideas and theories that these anti-colonial thinkers offer up. I really can't go into all of them here. I think there's a lot. Let me just mention a few others, and then I'll conclude. One, I think, has to do with the self and social identity. While George Herbert Mead at the University of Chicago in the early 20th century theorized the self as a coherent entity, and while Marx and Durkheim had offered up notions of the self as alienated or anomic, anti-colonial theorists articulated different approaches, mounted upon their distinct conceptualizations of society. Du Bois's early writings are exemplary, right? He talked about the racialized self in society, something that European philosophers had not theorized. He had this popular notion of double consciousness, right, that you might be familiar with. He compels us to think of the racialized self, the marginalized peoples, as having a subjectivity that is fractured into two, that is split into two. And this, might bear some similarities to Marxist theories of alienation, but I'd claim it's not reducible to it. For Du Bois, the fractured self was a product not of estranged labor, but of social practices in racialized societies. And it was a self that was not separated from some intrinsic essence rooted in an ideal of trans-historical labor. Double consciousness instead meant that the self was fundamentally split in two halves, whose structure troubles any sense of a singular self, alienated or otherwise. Fanon comes up with a similar idea when he talks about third-person consciousness. By being racialized, right, in this compartmentalized society, the colonized subject is also particularized, right? And so he has this particular thesis, idea of a third-person consciousness. So one way to think about these theories of the self is that they're capturing the distinct experiences of being a colonized or racialized subject, a marginalized subject, experiences about which most metropolitan social theories, most disciplinary sociologies at the time had very little to say. And they also capture how the particular social structures of racialized societies and compartmentalized societies generate distinct forms of subjectivity and existential dilemmas of social selfhood. Suzanne Césaire, the Martinican anti-colonial surrealist and supporter of the negritude movement, also discusses something similar in her 1942 essay, The Malaise of Civilization. And she goes into how the history of slavery in Martinique, the history of colonialism, had created a kind of subjectivity amongst Black Haitians that forced them to always be thinking about assimilating into dominant culture, and that they were then socialized into the idea that liberation means assimilation, and that this brings about similar dilemmas to those that Du Bois and Fanon talks about. So again, I think that what's going on here are these important and novel ideas of the self and social identity. Another theme is social solidarity. Of course, we all should be familiar with Durkheim's famous work on this theme. Durkheim theorized solidarity as a solution to social integration. Marx also talked about solidarity as essentially class solidarity. But anti-colonial thinkers, I think, complicated these notions. Again, consider Fanon, where he deploys the solidarity concept, but adds to it a critique of Marxist versions of the concept. In one of his articles, The Algerian Conflict and African Anti-Colonialism from 1957, he writes this: the necessary response to colonialism tactical cleverness is the strategic solidarity amongst the territories occupied by French forces. Today, we can measure the illusoriness of the famous doctrine according to which organic solidarity exists between the proletariat of colonialist countries and that of colonized peoples. In actual fact, the theory of anti-colonialism is being formulated today, and all the theses previously put forward have proven entirely false. In their struggle, colonized peoples must essentially count on their colonized brothers. So you see Fanon critiquing Marxist assumptions that class forms the basis of solidarity. This is what he means when he says the famous doctrine according to which organic solidarity exists between the proletariat of colonialist countries and that of colonized peoples. Fanon instead sees solidarity as a group unity that extends beyond class and beyond nation, and encompassing a shared identity among colonized peoples. This not only unmoors the concept from its Marxian variant, it also loosens it from its Durkheimian meaning. Solidarity is here not a natural product of the division of labor, but rather created through shared experiences of oppression and shared experiences of struggle against the dominant force. In short, in this theory of solidarity, it is oppression and struggle against it that generates solidarity. So again, rethinking and offering new ideas on sociological concepts. A third one is intersocietal dependence, global hierarchy, the constitutive character of empire. There's too much to talk about here. I would just say that there's a lot of people who helped articulate this. I would say one of the earliest ones was M.N. Roy, coming from India, and then of course going all the way through to other anti-colonial Marxist thinkers who talked about this global structure of society, right? Kind of early forms of world systems theory coming from anti-colonial thinkers. So again, lots of ideas. I don't have time to go into them here. I want to instead maybe head towards a conclusion by wrapping up with the issue I raised at the beginning about the larger conversations going on today about rethinking the canon, about overcoming Eurocentrism, about finding and expanding our theoretical repertoire. As I mentioned, my talk is part of this, larger conversation, this larger movement to, you could say, rethink the canon. In the US and across Europe, this classical social theoretical canon has largely been defined by Max Weber, Karl Marx, Durkheim, others like Talcott Parsons, and so on. But colleagues in social theory and sociology have been trying to overcome these limitations and think about other people to add, right? To open up social theory to other perspectives. So they talk about intellectuals from non-Western Europe, about adding African American sociologists like Du Bois, or female sociologists like Jane Addams. Other people talk about adding people like Ibn Khaldun to be read alongside European thinkers, and so on. So what you see is people, trying to overcome the limitations of dominant Eurocentric white male sociology and social theory. My project could be seen as part of these attempts. I'm hoping that anti-colonial thought might be taken more seriously as offering an alternative critical sociology too. My goal, to be clear, is not to replace Marx or Weber or Durkheim or Bourdieu or whoever. It is rather to alert us to other possible traditions that we might incorporate into our repertoire, right? So rather than restricting our standpoints, I want to proliferate them. And I think anti-colonial thought is one way to go. Further, my goal is not to presume that in anti-colonial thought, I'm finding a set of sociological ideas or discourses that are somehow outside of the dominant Western canon, somehow uncontaminated by Anglo-European influences. It exists in a space of critical engagement with European thinkers, right? Mabini, Fanon, César, Du Bois, they don't pretend to ignore Marx, for example, or Locke. They critically engage and sometimes creatively reappropriate them and their ideas. Third and finally, and then I'll conclude, my project is not reducible to a project that seeks to recover what's sometimes called Southern theory or non-Western or non-European theory. Now, I'm not against these projects, but I do worry that sometimes, depending upon how they are carried out, they fall prey to what I would call a geoepistemic essentialism. By this, I mean the ontological assumption that the world can be divided up into distinct essentialized geographical spaces, such as North and South or West and non-West, and that these spaces map directly onto cultures and knowledge formation. Some misreadings of the Southern Theory Project, for example, seeking to advance new critical social theories, mount their projects upon this kind of geoepistemic essentialism, right? They choose the new thinkers to be added to the repertoire based upon the thinker's geographic location. The assumption being that just because a thinker is in or from the global South or some other place, their knowledge is necessarily oppositional and therefore should count as critical alternative knowledge, should count as an alternative to the canon. Simultaneously, according to this geoepistemic essentialism, any thinker in or from the global North is to be rejected. This is highly problematic to me, right? Both in its ontology of the world and of knowledge, and its assumption, particularly, that geographic location maps onto knowledge. Note that by this criteria, W.E.B. Du Bois would not count for this alternative sociological canon because he spent his life in the United States. And by this criteria, any theorist or thinker from the non-European, non-Western world would be automatically relevant, regardless of their positionality within local hierarchies. Ibn Khaldun, for instance, does not represent a subaltern standpoint. He was a court thinker advising monarchs on how to perpetuate their empires. So it's here where my interest in anti-colonial thought lies. My point is not to divide up the world into distinct geographic regions and assume that knowledge from one site is superior to the other. Rather, as opposed to this ontology of geographically based cultures and knowledge, my interest in anti-colonial thought is grounded upon an ontology of global hierarchy forged by histories of colonialism and empire. I don't assume that Fanon or Mabel Dove or other people I've spoken about offer rich social insights that might help forge an alternative and critical sociology because they were from the global south, right? Instead, the wager is that they have potentially alternative and useful ideas about society because of their subordinated position in global hierarchies of power and their distinct experiences in their society that their ideas embed. In other words, the space of anti-colonial thought does not mark an essential position of race or geography, but a relational position of experience, of subordination, and of erasure. While imperial sociology embeds the experiences, interests, and concerns of metropolitan elites in the Anglo-European center, anti-colonial social theorists embed the standpoint of subjugated peoples whose voices and minds have been marginalized as lesser, inferior, as not offering valuable social knowledge at all. And so, to conclude, I'm suggesting that we might try to recover this body of thought. And doing so is to recover a true alternative to imperial sociology and its imperial standpoint. With that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. There were a lot of insights that we can discuss now. I would like just to open the floor for the questions, but please raise your hand and I will give you the floor. But I just wanted also to mention, just to give our audience some time to think about it, we also have a YouTube channel where all the recordings are published. We already have published the presentation of Raven Connell that Professor Go mentioned, and George Steinmetz as well, for example. So you can get familiarized with this presentation there, and the link is coming to the chat. I will also stop the recording.